been 5 years since that cold, dark and rainy morning in the small town of Autumnville. In Hollow Street, the townfolk, young and old, watched Hunter's body being carried from the ground into the ambulance. They whispered in their gossip and shivered with fear, watching the police cars and officers fill the ever-so-quiet street. The police found no sign of breaking and entering, and had first thought the young man either jumped or fell to his death with his bad history of intoxication. The neighboring folk, however, were adamant that Hunter didn't fall or jump, rather was pushed to his death. Their statements all intertwined with each other, describing the incident and the strange happenings leading to and from the murder. That house, they said, was haunted. Now I know what you may be thinking. Maybe the house was previously haunted. Maybe there was an evil entity that occupied it. Maybe the previous occupants were brutally murdered by a possessed member in that household. Amityville vibe kind of thing. Or maybe the land itself was cursed, having an eerie, creepy tainted history to it. Perhaps there was an evil entity that had been latched onto Hunter since his childhood and had been following him no matter which house he chose to live in, similar to Paranormal Activity. That does sound like your everyday cliche haunted house horror story, doesn't it? But this story is different. What if I told you the land wasn't cursed in any way? What if I told you that Autumnville had no prior supernatural encounters for as long as it stood, and Hunter had no paranormal episodes before, nor was there any evil entity latched onto him since birth? After all, how can a newly built house, merely 3 days old, be haunted? So, what really happened? Hunter's parents were so rich they could make people disappear if they wanted to. They knew their son couldn't stay out of trouble, therefore they bought him a house in Autumnville, a small town so boring, so quiet, and so far out away from temptation or bad company. The house took 3 months to build, much quicker than everyone else's, but money talks. A triple-story house painted with a darker shade of turquoise, quite fancy. Obviously in Autumnville, with people struggling to make ends meet, this was an insult. In the 3 months of construction, the noise had disturbed the person that lived opposite. Someone's house that looked similar to Hunter's, but upon closer inspection was built with cheaper wood and materials, since that's all that she could afford. The young woman with red hair went by the name Marianne, a student that traveled by bus to and from the university, then worked a job at the diner every evening. Tuition was expensive and some people weren't as fortunate as Hunter. On the first day of the house being built, Marianne reached Autumnville from the university and saw Hunter's character shine through, loud, rude and obnoxious, flaunting money that wasn't his to flaunt, and boasting about a life that never involved a single day's work. He would approach random women in the town, sweet-talk them with money, manipulate them just enough in thinking that he was serious about a relationship. It baffled Marianne on how they never saw that arrogant smirk slapped onto his face the entire time that he spoke. Hunter was a womanizer. These women thought they were lucky being taken to popular and expensive clubs and parties, making them feel special and important by dating a rich dude. Hunter gawked at their bodies perversely and touched them inappropriately, viewing women as objects rather than actual people. Saying Hunter was a prick would be an understatement. Whatever issue Hunter had, Mommy and Daddy Dearest would settle it with their money or make them disappear entirely. Whether it was the woman he abused, the police officers and club owners that he fought with, they would suddenly die of unknown causes a few days after. Then, 10 p.m. on the first night, on Marianne's way home back from the diner, Hunter drove his rich fast car recklessly, almost knocking her to the curb as she flipped the bird at him. And 4 hours later, the strange occurrences began. Marianne was heading to bed after a late night of studying. Through the window, she saw Hunter's car approaching slowly, then parked outside his home. But Hunter wasn't driving, rather sitting in the back, whereas a middle-aged couple was in the front, Hunter's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lionel. Their footsteps wary, movement shady as they escorted their drunken, wobbling son into his house. Hunter's parents kept turning back each time, looking out the window, paranoid that someone may have seen this unfold. They put on all the lights, making it seem like Hunter was home all along. Behind them, however, there was a black SUV parked a few spaces away. Two men wearing black suits and sunglasses got off the vehicle carrying a month's supply of groceries and a larger-than-life trolley suitcase. They entered the home, dropped off the stuff, walked out and drove away silently. 1 hour later, Mr. and Mrs. Lionel got into their son's vehicle and followed suit. It was only when the car faced the other side that Marianne saw the front corner was smashed. Looked like their son met with an accident, and judging by the groceries and the suitcase, looked like they were moving in. But the two men in the SUV weren't foolish, nor was this their first rodeo. They knew Marianne was awake when she moved the curtain, hence change of plan. 30 minutes later, they went back to the house and fetched the suitcase. That same morning at 5 a.m., quite dark and the streetlights still on, Denzel, a 54-year-old newspaper delivery man, rode his bicycle to the pickup point at the end of the street. Delivering newspaper in the rain sure did make the man's job difficult. But on his way, the old man was baffled. When he passed Hunter's home, he noticed the lights on. One light in particular, though, from the upstairs bedroom seemed to be flickering. The old man looked around and saw that no other house had that problem. That ruled out a substation issue. There was either a loose wire in that room, or someone, or something, had been responsible for turning the light off and on. Time was going and Denzel rode to the pickup point and picked up the newspapers. Front page headlines stated the weekly congregation held at the far end of Autumnville was postponed until further notice. The old man delivered the newspapers and on his way back noticed the flickering light from Hunter's home was now permanently turned off. Denzel couldn't explain it, but something about this house just felt off. When he reached the mailbox and put the paper inside, he heard a woman crying outside the house. Whimpering, sobbing, weeping, wailing. This was a woman in distress. These were cries for help. It was now 6 in the morning when the old man walked around the house, calling out to anyone that may be there. Then he had realized that it never came from outside. It came from the upstairs bedroom, the same room that had the flickering light. When Denzel looked up, he saw a pale, cloaked woman standing behind the window. Her hands distorted, disfigured, and broken. Her tears flowed like many rivers of blood, staining her face, but the weeping never stopped. But when the old man called out to her from below, the woman vanished into thin air, like smoke being blown in the wind. An eerie chill crawled on Denzel's skin. His heartbeat increased and body felt light, then shortly collapsed to the ground. The folk waiting for the bus in the morning, fetching their newspaper from the stand, saw Denzel faint. They approached him, splashed water on his face, and noticed how pale the old man was. "What's the matter, Denzel?" they asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." 9 a.m. sharp, the maid Alice that worked for Hunter's parents had now showed up to his home. She was meant to babysit the grown man, cooking for him, tidying up the house, and then leaving. However, what Alice experienced in that house that day still gives her nightmares. Hunter woke up at 2 p.m. holding his head, moaning with pain. Alice made a hot cup of black coffee for his hangover, which the man drank, then returned to bed. But he looked different, like something was deeply troubling him. Maybe it was just the hangover. Since he skipped breakfast and lunch, at 5 p.m. she cooked supper for the spoiled brat, then swept the upstairs hallway one more time before leaving. The house was quiet but felt heavy. The air did not feel clean no matter how much Alice dusted. Then there was a knock on the door. The maid was startled as she dropped the broom on the floor. It wasn't the front door or the back, but the room down the hallway. Alice put her ear against the door and called out to anyone that may be inside. No one else was supposed to be in that house. Thankfully, no one answered. But then... the doorknob began turning and rattling, like someone from the inside was trying to get out. The sound became more forceful and agitated, followed by loud bangs against the door. Alice felt the hair behind her neck rise and swallowed her saliva in gulps. "There anyone inside?" she asked repeatedly, but there was no answer. Her curiosity got the better of her and unlatched the door. She opened it just a tad bit, peeking her head around the corner and looking inside. Then a gush of wind blew forcefully as the maid lost her balance and fell to the ground. Alice left the broom where it was. She left her work unfinished and stormed out the house, screaming for her life, not realizing that she let something out. Her breathing heavy, her thoughts racing, and as she turned back to look at the house, the pale cloaked woman stood at the door. Her eyes were red from crying so much. Her skin tight and wrinkled, prayer beads around her neck, but instead of sobbing or frowning, the creepy woman had an eerie smile plastered on her face. And just like Denzel's encounter, she had vanished into thin air. 9 p.m. and Marianne was at the diner. She saw Hunter walking in, no arrogant smile, not loud or attention-seeking. The man looked lost, troubled, and terrified. He sat on the table deep in thought, trying to hide the strange scratch marks on his neck. Hunter was trying to remember. He knew he drank too much that night. What happened to his car? All that he remembered was his parents taking him inside as he vomited on the floor. But what happened before that? More importantly, who was this woman he saw in his dream? Reddish eyes, pale skin, wearing a darkened cloak. But why was she crying so much? Why did she look so familiar? Why did Hunter feel like this woman was watching him sleep? The man slept for so long and so deeply that he never even heard Alice screaming for her life and bolting out the door. Hunter then returned home from the diner at 10 p.m. In such a quiet town, even the road had ears. Hence, it was no surprise the townfolk heard Hunter's parents screaming at him over the phone, telling him to stay in the house and not make up any stories while they fixed his mess. That would be the last time they spoke to their son. Just past midnight, the townfolk heard Hunter screaming. They stormed outside and witnessed the front and back door opening and slamming shut unnaturally. The windows were tightly stuck no matter how much of force Hunter used to try and barge them open. The man made his way to the attic, and that was the only window that opened. He climbed over the window and held on tight. The bystanders couldn't see who he was talking to, only that it was something terrifying judging by his posture and mannerisms. Alas, in Hunter's final moments, the young man remembered who the ghostly woman was, but that wouldn't save him. The townfolk of Autumnville caught only a glimpse of a pale hand pushing Hunter out the attic window, falling face first to his death. The police and ambulance arrived on the scene and saw the man's head splattered onto the ground. The officers entered the house, inspected every room, but found no sign of struggle. Everything was clean and tidy. The windows weren't broken and the doors were locked. When the police took the statements of Marianne the waitress, the maid Alice, and the newspaper delivery man Denzel, they couldn't believe what they were hearing. You would expect the police to rule out any supernatural encounters and find logical reasoning. But how could they, when the townfolk spoke about a woman the police had just recovered, found folded into a trolley suitcase, dumped into a river? There was a small congregation held on the outskirts of Autumnville for bereaved folk. That is, those who have lost their loved ones either recently or in the past. This was a place for the heartbroken to speak to others going through the same pain as them. One night, Darlene the widow walked to the congregation. For years she suffered with grief, and a newspaper article mentioning a congregation being held for the bereaved had brought her peace for the first time in a long time. This was no scam, nor was there any money involved. Just folk sharing beloved memories and praying for those dealing with grief. Everyone that attended the congregation before mentioned that you could actually feel the presence of your lost loved one. Darlene found out too late, but would have done anything to feel the presence of her husband one more time. The poor woman walked miles on end in the pouring rain late at night, hoping the congregation never ended. That same night, wearing her black cloak with prayer beads around her neck and hope filled in her heart, had crossed the street on the pedestrian crossing directly under the streetlight. But Hunter, while under the influence on his way back home, ran the woman over. In his drunken panic state, he managed to call his beloved parents, slurring his words and explaining the situation. Mommy and Daddy Dearest arrived at the scene in the quiet ghost town, accompanied by their security, 2 men in black suits. Without hesitation, the security grabbed the woman's lifeless body and folded her into the larger-than-life suitcase, snapping her bones as they did so. They never realized that Darlene was still breathing when she caught a glimpse of Hunter and his parents. Then Mr. and Mrs. Lionel got into the car and drove their son home. The security followed behind them in a black SUV and used the groceries purchased earlier in the day as a cover-up when entering Hunter's home, making it seem like someone was going to stay there. Hunter's parents were more worried about the car damage. If there was a witness, a green, expensive car was not something that was difficult to see at night. Hence, they repaired it as soon as possible. But there was one mistake the 2 men in black had committed. When they waited for Marianne to sleep and fetched the suitcase, the zip opened and Darlene's prayer beads fell out. They were short on time, therefore they kicked it under the bed, zipped up the bag and dragged it back downstairs. Every bit of pain, every tear shed for her deceased husband, every prayer uttered by her tongue and every ache of her soul was latched onto those prayer beads. Her sorrowful cries sadly turned into laughs of insanity, and her vengeful spirit manifested in that room. Secrets, lies, murders, cover-ups and crimes could be pushed under the rug with the right amount of money and contacts, but there were just some things that money could not make disappear. While Hunter's parents never got arrested, they returned to their son's home to clear out the stuff and sell the house. But that same night, Alice found their bodies lying on the floor in the master bedroom. Just one night in that house and their hearts stopped, frozen with fear. Their deaths were declared as unknown causes. The townfolk never knew Darlene's story, but 5 years later, they still see the ghostly woman in that house. She would sit on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees that were tucked in her chest, swaying back and forth, weeping uncontrollably. The house in Hollow Street of Autumnville was indeed haunted, but most definitely not by an evil spirit. It was haunted by a bereaved woman that, while remained stuck in the veil, wished her husband knew just how much she loved and missed him, both in her life and death.